The morning sun filtered gently through the tall windows of the courthouse, painting long beams of golden light across the polished marble floors. People hurried in and out of the building, their shoes clicking softly as they whispered to each other about the big case scheduled for the day. Among them stood lawyers, clients, reporters, and curious townsfolk, all eager to see what might unfold. Daniel Carter, a young attorney with expensive taste and a reputation for arrogance, strode through the grand wooden doors with the confidence of a man who believed the world belonged to him. His black suit was pressed to perfection, his tie chosen carefully to stand out, and his shiny shoes reflected the lights above like mirrors. He carried a leather briefcase in one hand and a smirk on his face, the kind of smirk that made people roll their eyes but rarely challenged him. Daniel had worked hard to earn his law degree, but his real pride came not from knowledge, but from the way he could twist words, embarrass witnesses, and dominate anyone who stood in his way. In the courtroom, he thought of himself as a performer on a stage. Every raised eyebrow, every sarcastic chuckle, every dramatic pause was part of his act. The audience, whether jury, judge, or strangers in the gallery, was there to admire him, and he made sure they did. Today was no different. He knew his opponent's side had called an elderly woman to testify, and the very thought made him laugh. In his mind, the idea of an old grandmother taking the stand against him was nothing short of ridiculous. "This will be easy," he muttered under his breath as he adjusted his tie. "Like swatting a fly." Inside the courtroom, the air buzzed with quiet tension. The benches were almost full, with people leaning forward in their seats, ready to watch the drama. The judge, a man in his 60s with kind but tired eyes, shuffled some papers at his desk. He had seen Daniel before and knew his reputation. Sometimes, the young man's arrogance amused him, other times, it annoyed him deeply. At exactly 10 o'clock, the bailiff's voice rang out, commanding everyone to rise. The judge entered, and the trial officially began. Daniel stood tall, confident, and even winked at one of the reporters in the front row. He wanted the spotlight, and he was determined to keep it. Then came the moment that made the entire room shift. The door at the side opened, and Mrs. Eleanor Johnson slowly walked in. She was a black grandmother in her 70s, her back slightly bent with age, her steps careful but steady. She wore a simple navy blue dress, her silver gray hair tied neatly at the back. In her hand, she carried a worn leather bag, the kind that had seen many years of use. The room grew silent as she made her way forward. Something about her presence was different, not loud, not commanding, but strong in a quiet, unshakable way. Some people in the crowd felt an odd sense of respect just watching her take her place. But not Daniel. He leaned back in his chair, crossed his arms, and whispered to his colleague with a smirk, "This is their big witness. An old lady who probably can't even hear the questions. This will be fun." His voice carried just enough that a few people nearby turned and frowned, but Daniel didn't notice or didn't care. Eleanor slowly lowered herself into the witness chair, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her eyes, dark and calm, swept over the room, not in fear but in quiet observation. She didn't fidget, didn't look nervous. Instead, she sat with the kind of dignity that comes from a lifetime of challenges faced and overcome. Daniel, however, only saw weakness. To him, she was a symbol of everything outdated, fragile, and irrelevant. He believed the courtroom belonged to sharp young men like him, not to grandmothers who should, in his words, be at home baking pies. When the judge asked if everyone was ready to proceed, Daniel stood quickly, eager to begin. His voice rang out smooth and strong, dripping with self-assurance. He introduced himself in a way that sounded less like a formality and more like a performance. He wanted every eye on him, every head turned in his direction. The contrast between the two figures could not have been greater. On one side stood Daniel, young, polished, and arrogant, his energy loud and restless. On the other sat Eleanor, aged, calm, and steady, her presence quiet but oddly powerful. The audience could feel the tension in the air, as though they were watching a storm cloud form over still waters. What Daniel didn't realize was that this day would change him forever. He thought he was about to crush a fragile opponent, but instead, he was about to face one of the greatest lessons of his life. For now, though, he was blind to it. He straightened his papers, flashed a grin at the jury, and prepared to speak. He believed the show was his. He believed the courtroom belonged to him. And yet, as Eleanor sat patiently, her eyes never leaving his, a quiet truth lingered in the room. The real strength was not in the noise, not in the arrogance, and not in the sharpness of words. The real strength was waiting silently in the heart of the grandmother he was about to underestimate. The audience could not yet guess the twists ahead, but they sensed something. Perhaps it was the judge's thoughtful glance toward Eleanor, or the way she sat so still, or maybe the way Daniel's arrogance seemed too big, too heavy, too ready to fall. Whatever it was, the story had begun, and everyone in the room leaned forward, waiting for what would happen next. The courtroom settled into a hush as Eleanor Johnson adjusted herself in the witness chair. The bailiff swore her in, and she raised her right hand with calm dignity, her voice steady as she promised to tell the truth. There was no tremble, no sign of fear. Only patience. Daniel Carter, however, leaned against his table with a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He tapped his pen against his notepad, glancing at the jury as though sharing a private joke with them. To him, the situation was laughable. An elderly grandmother standing as a key witness against him. In his mind, this was a gift, a stage prepared just for his performance. When the judge nodded for him to begin his questioning, Daniel rose slowly, stretching his shoulders as though preparing for a casual stroll rather than a serious examination. He adjusted his suit jacket, buttoning it neatly, and then walked toward the witness stand with long, confident strides. "Good morning, Mrs. Johnson," he said, his voice smooth but dripping with sarcasm. "I hope you can hear me well. Should I speak slowly for you?" The words, though disguised as polite, carried a sting that made several people in the audience shift uncomfortably. Eleanor, however, did not flinch. She looked at him steadily, her dark eyes calm, and replied in a clear voice, "I can hear you just fine, young man." Daniel raised his eyebrows and tilted his head as if amused by her firmness. He clasped his hands behind his back and began pacing slowly, speaking loudly enough that everyone in the courtroom could hear. "Good, good. I wouldn't want to confuse you with any complicated questions." He let out a small chuckle, glancing briefly at the jury, as though inviting them to laugh along with him. A few people looked down, unwilling to meet his eyes. Eleanor folded her hands neatly in her lap, her posture straight. She did not return his smile, nor did she look insulted. Instead, she gave a small nod, as if to say, "Go ahead, son. Say what you must." Daniel felt the silence as resistance. He was used to witnesses snapping back, getting flustered, or stumbling over his words. But her stillness made him uneasy, though he did not admit it even to himself. To cover that discomfort, he leaned harder into his act. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, raising his voice in mock importance, "can you please tell the court what your qualifications are? I mean, surely someone like you must have decades of experience in law, right?" "Oh wait," he paused, pretending to remember something. "You're not a lawyer, are you?" The remark made the audience stir. Some gasped softly, others frowned, but Daniel thrived on their reaction. He thought it meant he had struck gold. Eleanor's voice was calm when she answered, "No, I am not a lawyer." Daniel clapped his hands once, softly but dramatically, as though confirming a point. "Exactly. Not a lawyer. Not trained in the law. Not sitting for years in law school, studying cases, writing long essays, passing exams. And yet, here you are, telling this court what you believe is right or wrong in a legal matter." He shook his head with a fake smile of pity. It's charming, truly. Like watching a child trying to explain mathematics to a professor. The judge's eyebrows twitched, but he said nothing yet. He was watching closely, waiting to see how far Daniel would take his mockery. Eleanor simply sat there, hands folded, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face. She neither frowned nor smiled, only listened. Her silence carried weight, though Daniel did not recognize it. He leaned closer, resting one hand on the edge of the witness stand. His voice dropped low, sharp like a blade. Tell me, Mrs. Johnson, do you even know what this law says? The one we are here debating? Or did someone just coach you before bringing you in? The insult was direct now, no longer disguised as politeness. Some people in the audience shook their heads, whispering to each other. A young man in the back muttered, "That's too much." But Daniel's ego was too inflated to notice. He was busy basking in the sound of his own voice. Eleanor's reply was simple. I know the law. Daniel threw his head back with a short laugh, the sound bouncing off the courtroom walls. You know the law? Well, forgive me, ma'am, but that's a bold statement from someone who's never practiced it. Perhaps you heard about it once, long ago. Maybe read about it in a newspaper? Or perhaps your grandson explained it to you at the dinner table. He spread his arms wide, turning to the jury, as though he were a comedian delivering his punchline. But this time, no one laughed. The silence that followed was heavy, awkward, even uncomfortable. Daniel mistook the silence for awe. He thought he was impressing them with his wit. He didn't realize that the audience was not laughing with him, they were holding their breath, waiting for Eleanor to respond. Slowly, she lifted her chin, her eyes calm but steady. There was no anger in her face, only patience, like a teacher waiting for a noisy student to tire himself out. She said nothing more, not yet. Her silence stretched across the room like a blanket, soft but undeniable. Daniel, however, mistook it for weakness. He grinned, smug and certain of his victory. No further questions for now, Your Honor, he said, walking back to his table with exaggerated confidence. He sat down, leaned back in his chair, and crossed his legs as if he had just delivered the winning blow. But the air in the courtroom told a different story. The spectators glanced at one another, uneasy. The judge scribbled something on his notepad, his lips pressed tight. Even the jury shifted in their seats, their faces betraying discomfort. And Eleanor? She sat as still as ever, her hands folded, her presence steady. She had not needed to raise her voice, nor defend herself with sharp words. She simply waited, knowing that the truth would come when the time was right. Daniel thought he had humiliated her. He thought he had won the room. But the seeds of his downfall had already been planted, and soon, everyone including him would see the truth. The silence after Daniel's mocking words hung in the courtroom like a heavy curtain. He had returned to his seat with a smug expression, certain that he had reduced the old grandmother to nothing more than a fragile figure in a chair. His pen tapped rhythmically against his notepad as though marking his victory. But Eleanor Johnson sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Her face did not show humiliation or fear. Instead, there was a calmness about her, a still strength that seemed to grow in the quiet moments. The judge noticed it. The jury noticed it. Even a few people in the gallery began to lean forward, curious about what this grandmother might say next. The opposing lawyer, a middle-aged woman named Clara Reed, stood and approached the witness stand. Clara was known for her sharp preparation but also for her kindness toward witnesses. She offered Eleanor a small, respectful smile before speaking. "Mrs. Johnson," she said softly, "I know you've been asked some difficult questions just now. Would you please tell the court, in your own words, why you are here today?" Eleanor nodded gently. Her voice, though not loud, carried a clarity that made people listen. I am here because I was asked to share the truth as I know it. The law being discussed in this case, it is not new to me. It is something I have studied for many years, and I have lived long enough to see how it has been used, and sometimes misused. Her words were steady, without anger, without pride. She spoke as if she were telling a story, not defending herself against mockery. The jury, who had just listened to Daniel's sharp sarcasm, found the softness of her tone strangely refreshing. Clara nodded, encouraging her. "Can you tell us about your background, Mrs. Johnson?" Daniel smirked again from his seat, expecting to hear about baking pies, sewing, or running church groups. He already prepared his next mocking comment in his head. But Eleanor surprised him. She adjusted her glasses and began, "I was born in the South in the 1940s. Times were very different then. I grew up when laws were not always fair to people like me. But my parents taught me that education was a weapon no one could take away. I studied hard, even when schools were divided and resources were scarce. Later, I went to college, and I worked for many years in community programs that focused on civil rights." The courtroom grew quieter. Even the scribbling of pen slowed down. "I spent much of my life," she continued, "attending meetings, reading laws, and helping others understand their rights. I may not have gone to law school, but I have spent decades surrounded by the language of justice. I have seen laws change, and I have seen how those changes affect real people. I came here today because I believe in truth, and I believe the law should serve the people, not harm them." Her words, delivered with patience and dignity, carried more weight than Daniel's flashy performance ever could. She did not need sarcasm, nor did she raise her voice. Every sentence she spoke felt like a slow stone placed carefully into a foundation, building something strong. Daniel shifted in his seat. He told himself it was nonsense, just sentimental storytelling meant to win sympathy. Yet something about her tone unsettled him. It was not weakness, it was something stronger, something he could not quite name. Clara stepped aside slightly, giving Eleanor space to continue if she wished. Eleanor did. "Earlier," she said gently, turning her eyes briefly toward Daniel, "I was asked if I know the law. And my answer remains the same: yes, I do. I know the law because I have seen it written, rewritten, debated, and lived. Laws are not just words in a book. They are promises to the people. And when those promises are broken, it is our duty to speak up." The judge, who had been listening with unusual attentiveness, leaned back in his chair. His expression softened, as though he too felt the weight of her truth. One juror, an elderly man, adjusted his glasses and nodded slowly to himself. Another juror, a young woman in her 20s, bit her lip as if holding back emotion. Daniel noticed these shifts and grew restless. He tapped his pen harder, forcing a grin on his face. But the room no longer looked at him the same way. The attention had shifted. The grandmother he thought he had crushed was commanding the room without even trying. Eleanor's calmness worked like water against fire. Where Daniel had tried to burn with sarcasm, she cooled the air with patience. Where he had tried to cut with words, she healed with wisdom. When Clara finished her questions, she said softly, "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson." Eleanor gave a small nod, then folded her hands again, waiting quietly. The judge cleared his throat, his voice calm. "Mr. Carter, do you have any further questions for the witness?" Daniel rose quickly, trying to shake off the unease creeping into his chest. He forced a laugh. "Yes, Your Honor. Just a few." He walked back toward the stand, though his steps lacked the swagger they had carried earlier. He looked down at Eleanor, but her steady gaze met his. It wasn't defiance, it was something gentler, yet more powerful. Like a grandmother watching over a child who hadn't yet learned his lessons. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but then smirked again to cover it. "Mrs. Johnson, that was a touching story. Truly. But let's not mistake emotional speeches for actual law. The words sounded sharp, but they lacked the sting of before. The jury did not lean forward with interest. Instead, some frowned. One even looked away, unimpressed. Daniel felt it. The balance was shifting, and for the first time, he was not sure how to control it. Eleanor said nothing more in that moment, but her calm response had already spoken volumes. Without raising her voice, without arguing, she had begun to turn the tide of the trial. And though Daniel still believed he was in control, the truth was clear to everyone else: the old grandmother had more strength in her quiet dignity than he had in all his arrogance. The courtroom, once filled with Daniel's smug laughter, now carried the echo of Eleanor's calm words. And those words lingered in the air, planting seeds in the minds of the jury, seeds that would grow stronger as the trial continued. The next morning, the courtroom filled with the same quiet anticipation as before. People whispered in the wooden benches, curious to see how the trial would unfold. Word had already spread around town about the elderly grandmother who had stood firm against Daniel Carter's arrogance. Reporters scribbled in their notepads, ready to capture the day's events. Daniel, however, arrived with his usual swagger. He convinced himself that the previous day had been nothing but a slip, a moment where the jury had been distracted by sympathy. Today, he promised himself, he would win back the stage. He had spent hours the night before studying the statute at the heart of the case. He memorized every line, every phrase, and even prepared clever remarks to throw at Eleanor. To him, this was no longer just about the case. It was about pride. He could not allow an old woman to steal his spotlight. He was determined to remind everyone in that room that he was the one trained in law, the one with authority, the one who should be admired. The judge entered, and the trial resumed. Soon enough, Eleanor Johnson was called back to the witness stand. She walked with the same steady steps as before, her face calm, her hands holding the same worn leather bag. She took her seat, lifted her chin, and folded her hands neatly in her lap. Daniel rose immediately, papers in hand. He strode toward the witness stand, his eyes sharp, his voice louder than necessary. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, "yesterday you gave us quite a story. Touching, yes, but this is a court of law, not a place for bedtime tales." The words made several people in the gallery shift uncomfortably. But Daniel pressed on, convinced his performance was powerful. He flipped open the statute book he carried and waved it slightly in the air. "Today," he declared dramatically, "we will speak about facts. Cold, hard law. The very law that governs this case." He tapped the book with his finger. "This is my territory, not yours." Eleanor's eyes did not leave his. Her calm gaze seemed to soften the sharpness of his words. "Go ahead," she said quietly. Daniel grinned, thinking he had regained control. He read aloud from the statute, his voice ringing through the courtroom. The words were heavy, technical, filled with legal language that confused many in the room. He looked at the jury often, as if to say, "See how brilliant I am? See how complicated this is? Surely you don't expect her to understand this." When he finished reading, he slammed the book closed for dramatic effect. "Now, Mrs. Johnson," he said with mock politeness, "could you please explain to us what all that means? Or was it too difficult to follow?" The challenge hung in the air. Daniel leaned back slightly, arms crossed, confident that she would stumble. But Eleanor did not stumble. She leaned forward just a little, her voice clear and patient. "Yes," she said, "I can explain what it means." The courtroom fell silent. Even the faint scratching of pens stopped. She began slowly, not rushing, as though she were teaching a classroom of children who deserved her full attention. She explained the meaning of each line Daniel had read, breaking down the legal phrases into plain, simple words. She described why the law was written, what problem it was meant to solve, and how it had been applied over the years. Her explanation was not rehearsed, it was natural, flowing from memory and experience. She spoke of meetings held decades ago, debates among lawmakers, and the importance of making sure the law was fair. The jury leaned forward, listening with open eyes. The judge rested his chin on his hand, following every word. Even the people in the gallery were nodding slowly, surprised at how easily Eleanor untangled the complex language. Daniel's smug smile faded. His pen, which he had been tapping, went still. He tried to interrupt once. Objection, Your Honor, the witness is giving a lecture, not an answer, but the judge overruled him. Objection denied, the judge said calmly. The witness is explaining in direct response to your question, Mr. Carter. Please proceed. Eleanor continued, unbothered. She did not raise her voice, nor did she gloat. She simply told the truth, explaining the law with a clarity Daniel had never managed, despite all his training. By the time she finished, there was a quiet awe in the courtroom. One juror whispered to another, she explained it better than the lawyer did. Daniel's face grew red. His pride felt wounded, and anger bubbled in his chest. He leaned closer, desperate to regain control. Are you suggesting, he said sharply, that you know this law better than the attorneys in this room? Eleanor paused, her gaze steady. Then she replied with calm certainty, I know this law because I helped write it. The words struck like a stone dropped into still water. The echo of her statement rippled through the room. Gasps filled the air. A reporter nearly dropped his pen. Daniel froze, his mouth slightly open. He blinked as if he had misheard. You helped write it, he repeated, his voice weaker than before. Eleanor nodded gently. Yes. Decades ago, I was part of a committee that worked with lawmakers to create this very statute. We wanted to make sure it protected people who had been treated unfairly. I remember the debates, the drafts, the nights spent reading every word. So, when I say I know the law, young man, I do not say it lightly. The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge raised his gavel to quiet the crowd, but even he looked impressed, almost humbled. Daniel stood frozen in place. His arrogance, his rehearsed lines, his dramatic gestures, all of it felt suddenly small. He had mocked her, dismissed her, even laughed at her. And now, in front of the entire court, it was revealed that she carried more authority on the matter than he ever could. Eleanor did not smile in victory. She did not need to. She simply sat quietly, her presence speaking louder than words. Her calmness, her patience, and her truth had cut deeper than any insult ever could. Daniel lowered his eyes for the first time. His pride cracked, though he tried desperately to hold himself together. But everyone in the room knew the balance of power had shifted. And from that moment on, the arrogant lawyer was no longer the master of the courtroom. The grandmother he mocked had taken that role, and she held it with quiet grace. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. Eleanor's quiet words, I helped write it, still echoed in everyone's mind. The jury sat stunned, their faces a mixture of surprise and respect. Even the judge leaned back in his chair, his usually calm expression replaced by one of genuine astonishment. Daniel Carter, the once confident lawyer, stood frozen in place. His hand, which had been gripping the edge of the witness stand, slowly loosened. His mind scrambled for a response, but no clever remark came. For the first time in his career, silence wrapped around him like chains. Eleanor, on the other hand, remained composed. She didn't boast or gloat. She simply adjusted her glasses, folded her hands in her lap, and waited patiently, as if the truth needed no decoration. The judge finally cleared his throat. Mrs. Johnson, he said carefully, are you telling this court that you were directly involved in drafting the statute Mr. Carter cited? Yes, Your Honor, Eleanor replied with calm assurance. Many years ago, I was invited to be part of a citizens advisory group. We worked alongside lawmakers and legal experts to create language that protected ordinary people from unfair practices. It was not easy, but it was necessary. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled frantically, their pens scratching across their notepads. Some spectators shook their heads in disbelief, while others smiled in admiration. Daniel felt his stomach twist. He had mocked her, dismissed her, even suggested she couldn't understand the law. And yet here she was, a woman who had helped shape the very words he had proudly recited just minutes earlier. Desperate to regain control, Daniel forced a laugh. It sounded hollow, unnatural. "Well," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "that's a remarkable story, Mrs. Johnson. But surely you don't expect us to believe that a committee of ordinary citizens had real influence over such an important law." Eleanor turned her gaze toward him, not with anger, but with patience. "Young man," she said softly, "laws are not written by lawyers alone. They are written for the people, with the people. Our voices mattered then, and they matter now. I was one of many who insisted that this law include protections for the vulnerable. And those words remain in the text you just read." The jury shifted, glancing at one another. The truth of her words was undeniable. Clara Reed, Eleanor's attorney, rose slowly. "Mrs. Johnson," she said gently, "could you share with the court what that experience was like? What did it mean for you to be part of that process?" Eleanor nodded. She took a deep breath, and her voice carried warmth as she spoke. "It was one of the hardest and most important times of my life. I remember sitting in rooms filled with men in suits, speaking quickly, using complicated words. At first, I felt small. But then I remembered why I was there. I wasn't there for myself. I was there for my community, for families who had been silenced, for workers treated unfairly, for neighbors who needed hope. So, I spoke. I told them our stories. And slowly, they listened." Her words painted a vivid picture. Listeners could almost see the young Eleanor, decades earlier, sitting at a table filled with lawmakers, her voice rising among theirs. She continued, "It was not easy. Some dismissed me, just as Mr. Carter has today. But I kept speaking. And in the end, my words became part of the law. That is why I know it so well. Not because I read it yesterday, but because I lived it." The courtroom was silent. Even Daniel, who normally thrived on interruption, found himself unable to speak. His throat felt dry, his confidence cracked. The judge leaned forward, his voice respectful. "Mrs. Johnson, your testimony is extraordinary. Please continue if you wish." Eleanor gave a small nod. "What I want this court to remember," she said, "is that laws are more than words on paper. They are promises to the people. And when those promises are ignored or twisted, justice is lost. That is why I am here, not to argue, not to win a battle of pride, but to remind us all of what this law was meant to protect." Her words were not fiery, but they carried power. They touched something deeper than logic. They reached the hearts of those listening. The jurors were no longer just hearing a witness, they were hearing history, wisdom, and truth. A few nodded quietly, others scribbled notes, but all of them looked at Eleanor with newfound respect. Daniel sank slowly into his chair, his earlier arrogance slipping away like sand through his fingers. He replayed his mocking words in his head, asking if she had heard the law at dinner, comparing her to a child. Shame burned in his chest. For the first time, he realized that his pride had blinded him. Eleanor did not look at him with scorn. Instead, when her eyes met his, there was something unexpected, something that unsettled him more than anger would have. It was compassion. It was as if she saw not just the arrogant lawyer before her, but the young man behind the mask, the one desperate to prove himself, the one who had not yet learned that arrogance is weakness disguised as strength. The revelation was not only about her past role in shaping the law. It was also a revelation for Daniel himself. He began to see, dimly, that he was not as powerful as he believed, and that true authority did not come from mocking others, but from serving truth. The judge finally spoke again, his voice steady. "Thank you, Mrs. Johnson. Your testimony will be entered into record. You may step down." Eleanor rose slowly, gathering her worn leather bag. As she walked back to her seat, the courtroom watched in silence. She did not bask in the attention, nor seek applause. She simply walked with quiet dignity, as though her role was finished. But the revelation she left behind lingered in every heart. She was not just a grandmother on a witness stand. She was a living part of history, a keeper of justice, and a reminder that wisdom often comes from those whom the proud are quickest to dismiss. Daniel stared at his notes, but the words blurred before his eyes. For the first time, he wondered if the real lesson of the trial had nothing to do with the case and everything to do with the person he had mocked. The courtroom was unusually quiet. After Eleanor Johnson's revelation, the air felt different, heavier, but also full of respect. Every person in the room seemed to carry the weight of her words. The jurors sat straighter, their pens still, their faces thoughtful. The judge, usually stern, looked almost softened by what he had heard. Daniel Carter, however, sat frozen at his table. The once confident lawyer who had strutted around the courtroom now looked like a man lost in his own thoughts. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his notes, but the words written on them seemed meaningless. He had spent the whole case trying to prove his brilliance, but in one quiet testimony, Eleanor had stripped away his pride. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Mr. Carter," he said firmly, "do you wish to continue your questioning, or shall we proceed?" Daniel stood slowly. His legs felt heavier than before, as if each step carried the weight of his arrogance. He walked toward the witness stand again, but his stride had changed. The swagger was gone. Instead of confidence, there was hesitation. Eleanor sat calmly, waiting. Her eyes followed him with patience, not judgment. She looked at him the way a grandmother might look at a restless child, firm but compassionate. Daniel cleared his throat. His voice was quieter than usual when he spoke. "Mrs. Johnson," he began, "you've told us that you helped write this law. You've explained its meaning, its purpose, better than anyone else in this room." He paused, glancing at the jury, then back at her. "I must admit, I underestimated you." A ripple went through the courtroom. It was rare to hear Daniel admit weakness. But he wasn't finished. He lowered his eyes for a moment, then forced himself to continue. "When you first walked into this courtroom, I saw only an elderly woman. I assumed you were out of place, that you couldn't possibly understand the law. I mocked you, and I disrespected you in front of everyone here. That was wrong." The jury leaned forward, watching intently. Even the judge's eyebrows lifted in surprise. Eleanor said nothing. She let him speak, her silence more powerful than any interruption. Daniel swallowed hard. "I've built my career on being clever, on twisting words, on making people feel small so that I could feel big. But today I've been reminded that knowledge without respect is nothing. That arrogance blinds more than ignorance ever could." For the first time, his voice cracked. He quickly steadied it, but the vulnerability was clear. He took a step back, his shoulders lowering as though a heavy burden had finally begun to slip off. "Mrs. Johnson, I apologize. Not only to you, but to this court, and to everyone here who had to witness my arrogance. You have more wisdom in your silence than I've ever had in all my speeches." The gallery was utterly silent. A few spectators exchanged glances, others nodded quietly. The jurors shifted, some clearly moved by what they were hearing. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice gentle but steady. "Young man," she said, apology is the first step toward growth. We all stumble. What matters is whether we rise with humility or fall deeper into pride. Her words, spoken softly, hit Daniel harder than any lecture could have. His chest tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye. But when he finally did, he saw no anger, only a patient kindness that felt almost undeserved. Clara Reed, Eleanor's lawyer, stood and addressed the court. Your Honor, I think we've all seen the truth unfold in this room. The law speaks for itself, but Mrs. Johnson's testimony has reminded us why it exists in the first place. The judge nodded slowly. His gaze lingered on Eleanor, then shifted to Daniel. Mr. Carter, he said firmly, this court respects the passion of its attorneys, but passion must be guided by respect. I trust today has been a lesson for you. Daniel bowed his head. Yes, Your Honor, he said softly. The trial continued with formalities, but the energy of the room had changed. It no longer felt like a battle of egos, but like a lesson unfolding before everyone's eyes. Eleanor had not only defended the truth of the law, she had revealed the emptiness of arrogance. When Eleanor finally stepped down from the stand, the audience watched her with admiration. She did not bask in the attention, she simply walked with her same steady steps, her worn leather bag at her side. But to many, she looked taller than before, her quiet dignity filling the room. Daniel returned to his seat, his head bowed slightly. For once, he did not tap his pen, did not smirk at the jury, did not seek the spotlight. His thoughts were heavy, but in that heaviness, there was something new, a small spark of humility. He realized that the trial had not only been about winning or losing a case. It had been about him facing himself. And in that mirror, held up by Eleanor's calm strength, he had seen the flaws he had long ignored. As the judge called for a recess, Daniel remained seated, staring at his hands. Eleanor walked past him on her way out of the courtroom. For a brief moment, their eyes met. She gave him the slightest nod, a gesture both forgiving and firm. It was not a victory lap, it was a reminder. A reminder that true strength was not in arrogance, but in humility. Not in loud speeches, but in quiet truth. And in that moment, Daniel Carter knew, he had been humbled. The courtroom was quiet as the trial neared its conclusion. The tension that had filled the air in the previous days had softened, replaced with a sense of reflection. The once arrogant lawyer, Daniel Carter, sat in his chair, a shadow of the man he had been. His eyes, which had once sparkled with pride, now held humility. He no longer tapped his pen, no longer smirked at the jury, no longer sought to dominate the room with words. Eleanor Johnson, meanwhile, remained as composed as ever. She had testified with honesty and patience, revealing the truth behind the law she had helped write decades ago. Her presence carried dignity, quiet yet unshakable. She had not sought applause, nor had she demanded recognition. And yet, she had earned both. The jury listened carefully as the judge summarized the facts of the case. He spoke slowly, highlighting the importance of the law and the witness testimonies that had guided their understanding. When he mentioned Eleanor's contribution, a ripple of acknowledgement ran through the courtroom. Daniel felt it too, a subtle, yet undeniable acknowledgement of her strength. As the final arguments were presented, Daniel stood once more. But this time, he spoke differently. Gone was the arrogance, replaced by measured words and genuine respect. Your Honor, members of the jury, he began, I have learned something very important over the course of this trial. It is not always the loudest voice that carries truth, nor the most confident that holds wisdom. Today, I witnessed the strength of experience, patience, and courage. The jurors looked at him with surprise. His tone had changed completely. Daniel continued, Mrs. Johnson has reminded us all that respect and understanding matter more than ego. I came here thinking I knew everything, only to discover that humility and listening are far more powerful than pride. For that, I am grateful. Eleanor looked at him, her calm expression betraying nothing, yet there was a soft acknowledgement in her eyes. It was a recognition of growth, of someone who had faced the truth and chosen to learn from it. After the closing arguments, the judge addressed the courtroom. This case has been about more than just legal interpretation. It has been about the principles of justice, fairness, and the value of every voice in this court. I trust that the lessons learned here will extend beyond these walls. The jurors retired to deliberate, leaving the room in a rare silence. Daniel remained seated, staring at Eleanor as she quietly collected her belongings. He felt a sense of reverence he had never experienced before in a courtroom. The woman he had mocked, dismissed, and underestimated had taught him a lesson that no law school or courtroom could ever provide. When the jury returned, their faces were solemn yet respectful. They had reached a verdict that upheld the law as intended, but more importantly, they had been influenced by Eleanor's testimony and the lessons it carried. The courtroom understood not just the judge, not just the lawyers, but everyone present that justice was more than technicalities. It was rooted in integrity, experience, and humility. After the verdict was announced, Eleanor stepped down from the witness stand. Reporters rushed forward, eager to capture her words, but she moved gracefully, answering questions with patience. She spoke about the importance of civic engagement, about how ordinary citizens can influence the law, and about the responsibility to speak out when injustice arises. Every word was measured, yet impactful, leaving an impression far beyond the courtroom walls. Daniel watched from a distance, feeling a profound shift within himself. He realized that his role as a lawyer was not merely to win cases, but to serve truth and fairness. He had been consumed by pride and arrogance, but Eleanor's calm wisdom had opened his eyes. He no longer sought to belittle others to prove himself. Instead, he began to understand the value of listening, learning, and respecting every voice. As the courtroom emptied, Daniel approached Eleanor quietly. He did not speak theatrically, nor did he try to charm. He simply said, "Mrs. Johnson, I want to thank you. Not for the case, but for reminding me what true strength looks like. I will not forget this lesson." Eleanor nodded gently. "We all have lessons to learn, young man," she replied softly. "The question is whether we listen and change. I hope you do." Daniel nodded, feeling a mix of humility and resolve. He knew he had been humbled, but not broken. Instead, he had been given a chance to grow, to become a better lawyer, and perhaps, a better person. Outside the courthouse, the sun was beginning to set. Eleanor walked slowly, her steps steady, her heart content. She had done her duty, spoken her truth, and reminded an entire room that wisdom and experience cannot be measured by age, but by courage and integrity. Daniel followed a few steps behind, reflecting on the events that had unfolded. The lesson would stay with him always that arrogance can blind, but humility opens eyes. That strength is not loud, but patient. And that respect, once earned, leaves a mark far deeper than any courtroom victory ever could. As the crowd dispersed, whispers of admiration followed Eleanor. The old grandmother had become a symbol, not just of knowledge, but of dignity, patience, and courage. Daniel had learned the hard way that mockery fades, but truth and humility endure. And in that quiet evening light, both teacher and student left the courthouse transformed. One, carrying the weight of years of wisdom, the other, carrying the beginning of understanding. Both reminded the world that justice is not only written in laws, but in the way we respect and honor the voices that shape them. The courtroom had changed forever, not through arguments or motions, but through the calm, unwavering strength of a grandmother who refused to be underestimated. And Daniel Carter, once arrogant and mocking, had finally learned to listen, to respect, and to grow.